an extraordinary end to what has been a bizarre and dramatic day. In the last few minutes, Hunter Biden has pled guilty to each of those 9 tax-related charges against him, and Judge Mark Scarsi has now set a sentencing date of December 16th. We are awaiting Hunter Biden's departure from the courthouse now. It all began with an unusual arrival in that he showed up and was dropped off curbside by Secret Service, when in every other hearing in this case he has been driven in to an underground garage. That's when we thought this might be an unusual day. Then Abby Lowell, one of his lead attorneys, dropped the bombshell that he wanted to change his plea, Hunter Biden, to guilty. There was an objection from the Department of Justice prosecutors because they said he was trying to enter a guilty plea while at the same time, under what is called an Alford plea, maintaining his innocence. So then there was some back and forth between the two sides. Ultimately, the prosecution were allowed to read the entire 56-page indictment this afternoon in court, and then Judge Scarsi went through each of those 9 charges, said, how do you plead? In each case, Hunter Biden said guilty, and the court chose to accept what Judge Scarsi is now calling an open plea rather than an Alford plea. So bottom line, Hunter Biden has now pled guilty to those 9 tax fraud-related charges, and he will be sentenced on December 16th. The maximum sentence he can receive, 17 years in prison and $1 million in fines. President Biden has said all along, of course, that he will neither pardon Hunter Biden in this case or indeed in his gun case. Neither will he commute the sentence. Of course, President Biden said those things before he decided not to run again for the presidency. So sentencing December 16th, we'll see what President Biden on his way out of the White House in January then does.
Hunter Biden, the president's son, pleaded guilty on all counts in his federal tax evasion case. Hunter Biden faced 9 charges, including 3 felony and 6 misdemeanor counts. The charges are related to his alleged failure to pay taxes and tax evasion from 2016 through 2019, when he was struggling with a drug addiction. The president's son owed nearly $1.5 million in unpaid taxes that was eventually paid back. Now, today's surprise developments come just months after Hunter Biden was convicted of lying on a 2018 federal form to purchase a gun he owned for 11 days.
Well, I think Hunter Biden's legal team reached the maybe non-controversial conclusion that there's no way he was going to win this case, and that standing trial would basically put a spotlight on all the sordid activities that he had engaged in over the last few years, which would happen at a very politically sensitive time. Obviously, his father's no longer a candidate, but I could see how they didn't want all of these things being aired. So they decided to plead guilty. They originally tried to negotiate an Alford plea, which is a rare and unusual and controversial maneuver. Didn't surprise me that the Justice Department rejected it out of hand, but then they came quickly back to the judge and said he'll just enter an open plea, which is a normal plea of guilty. The judge accepted it and has now set sentencing for Hunter Biden in December.
And what do you think, while he faces a maximum of 17 years in prison, what do you think ultimately could be decided by the judge on December 16th?
I don't see the judge imposing anything anywhere close to the maximum sentence of 17 years. I think the judge will impose something far less than that. In all likelihood, I would think probably less than 5 years. But in a way, the larger point here is that, of course, he's also got in his back pocket, Hunter Biden, a pardon, or at least a very good possibility of a pardon from outgoing President Biden, who has said he won't pardon his son. But of course, he made that pledge before he withdrew as a candidate. So this sentencing proceeding is obviously important. But at the end of the day, the big question is going to be whether President Biden, on his last days in office, pardons his son.
Cases and this trial is going to reveal are very, very embarrassing details, not just about his own life, but potentially about his father, about pay-for-play schemes and the like. And I personally think DOJ is going to be far more aggressive than they normally would, because they have to rehabilitate themselves after being exposed for giving him that plea deal of a lifetime last year. And now there's no real stakes for them because Joe Biden is out of the race. So there's no political impact specifically for him and the 2024 election. And he's likely to lose. And so I'm surprised he's going forward. But, today starts jury selection. So here we are.
But in the back of every juror's mind, you got to figure, OK, if we find him guilty, his dad on the last day in office in January is going to pardon his son. I know the president has said, I'm not going to do it, not going to do it. Carrie, he's going to do it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And he also could commute his sentence. But in order for him to commute a sentence, Hunter Biden has to be sentenced. And that can take time, right? For instance, Donald Trump was convicted in New York in early June, and his sentencing is not for another few weeks. That's a few months. And time is not on Hunter Biden's side unless you want to roll the dice. It's possible that Kamala wins, but we don't know. He certainly doesn't know. And you'd think he'd want to speed this up as much as possible. But Steve, to your broader point, I don't see how this is sympathetic to a jury. You have people in America who are struggling, paycheck to paycheck. They pay their taxes. It's a huge burden, and they don't have the luxury of having their dad get them out of it if they fail to do so. In fact, there's really only one person in this country who has that privilege, and it's Hunter Biden. And we're going to hear details about how he wrote off, expenses like prostitutes and drugs and all these kinds, his business expenses. This is just not sympathetic to a jury.
Yeah, Dana, this is a surprise development. So ordinarily, when a defendant pleads guilty, he goes in front of the judge in court and says, I'm guilty as charged. I did it, and here's what I did that makes me guilty. Now, this is what's technically called an Alford plea. People may be more familiar with the term you sometimes see on TV of a no contest or nolo contendere, if you want to use the Latin, where essentially what Hunter Biden is asking to do is to go into the federal court and say, I'm not admitting my guilt. I'm not admitting that I'm guilty of these charges. Instead, I acknowledge that the prosecution thinks they have the proof, and I'm willing to take your sentence, Judge, based on the indictment as is. It's very, very rare to see this type of plea happen, or even an attempt to have this type of plea happen in federal court.
And Ellie, do prosecutors talk about sort of the history of, if you know broadly, whether or not prosecutors usually accept this type of plea? I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot here, but if you were the prosecutor in this case, is this something that you think that you would consider? So, especially given, and as you answer that, I just want to add a little bit of context to this. Hunter Biden has paid back those taxes.
Right.
It's not as if those taxes are outstanding, even though he did owe more than 1 year and owed a lot of money.
So it is official Justice Department policy, and this is a DOJ federal case, that you do not, as a prosecutor, accept an Alford plea except for in extraordinary circumstances. You asked about my experience. I was a prosecutor for 14 years, never accepted an Alford plea.
Wow.
Once in a while, a defense lawyer would call and say, hey, my guy's willing to take an Alford plea. And frankly, we'd laugh at them. We'd say, no way, we don't do that. That's a joke. However, what Hunter Biden certainly can do, and perhaps this is his next step if this doesn't work, is nobody can stop him from just pleading guilty to the indictment as is. Now, he's charged with various tax crimes, so nobody can stop him. It doesn't matter if the prosecutor likes it or not. Hunter Biden can always go into that court and say, I'm guilty as charged. But on this issue of the Alford plea, the no contest plea, not at all surprising that Evan just reported that DOJ, the prosecutors, are against it.